So usually when I go to large Magic events now, I don't end up actually playing that much Magic. What I do is go to the events mostly just to hang out, to meet people, maybe some people that view the channel, give out a lot of hash up OACs, seances, and that kind of thing. However, this past weekend, I went to one of the face-to-face tour events hosted by Face-to-Face Games, and I ended up playing in one of their Pioneer qualifier events, and I kind of won the whole thing with this deck you see here. And it's kind of funny because this could almost just be a standard deck, because what happened was I really wanted to play standard because I've been playing a lot of standard on Magic Arena. I've been streaming it on my Twitch channel. I really like that mono red deck, but there just aren't any standard in paper events, so it's not even possible to play standard in person. So what I did was basically take my standard deck and enter that into the Pioneer event. I did make a couple of small adjustments. You can see cards like these here, but the deck is very similar to the mono red standard deck. So I believe there were 31 people in the event, so it was a 5-round event with the top 8, and I was fortunate enough to go undefeated in the tournament. I actually don't remember what my first round opponent was playing. The second round opponent, though, they were on the Gruul aggro / mid-rangey kind of deck. The third round matchup was against mono green. It was kind of, I think it must be a newer version. I hadn't seen a whole lot of this one before, but I want to call it basically mono green storm, because it was basically like the opponent would set up some kind of loop with, Nykthos, Karn, and Kiora, and then just keep on tapping and untapping stuff and tutoring things up, and then eventually kill me somehow with the Stone Brain. That one was very close. The opponent won the first game, and then I won the second one with exactly lethal with burn spells, and then the third one, the opponent had kind of a suboptimal draw and wasn't able to deploy their cards fast enough, and I had a pretty fast start. And then for rounds 4 and 5, I was able to just double draw into the top 8. Then for the quarterfinal matchup, I played against a blue-white Spirits deck. I think the person might watch my videos, but that was a very fun matchup. It was pretty intense. The first game, I was on the play because I was a higher seed. The first game, though, I mulliganed to 4 and lost that game. Second game, I was able to win, and then the third game, we basically whittled down all of our resources. My opponent had basically a handful of answers and answered all of my threats, and it was basically a situation where we were both just top decking for quite a while. However, I was able to, top deck a little bit better and was able to win. I even actually ended up casting my sideboard companion Gigantha that game. It didn't really do a whole lot other than eat a counterspell, but I did cast it. So that was the quarterfinal, and then for this event, the top 4 players all got a qualification for the regional championship, so the top 4 decided to just split the prizes. So I got the regional championship qualifier and some cool prizes. But I wanted to talk about it mostly because of just this deck that I was playing. As I said, it's almost just a standard deck, but also I wanted to talk about this card in particular. We're going to get to that in just a moment. So this is mono red aggro. It has always been and probably will always be a viable deck in Pioneer, I hope at least. But the way I've built it here is a little bit different. I tried to build this very low to the ground, and I really want to try and push through damage using my creatures. There are a lot of burn spells, but not as many as some versions of this deck might have. So for 1-drops, obviously we're playing 4 copies of Monastery Swiftspear. It's the best mono red 1-drop, potentially even in Modern, really, outside of, I guess, something like Ragavan. But this card even gives Goblin Guide a run for its money, so obviously we're playing that. There's this Kumano Faces Kakazan. This card is really good. I like it a lot. I see this in most of the mono red deck lists, so it's kind of universally agreed upon, it seems, that this is definitely a Pioneer playable 1-drop. And then we've also got Phoenix Chick here. This is 1 out of standard. I do see some deck lists playing this, but what a lot of deck lists have instead of this is Soulscar Mage, because when you're looking at mono red 1-drops, usually you would go to immediately Monastery Swiftspear, and then for your other one you would play Soulscar Mage, because they are very similar and Soulscar Mage is very good. But I've chosen to play Phoenix Chick over Soulscar Mage in this deck for a few reasons. The main ones being that Phoenix Chick has haste where Soulscar does not, and Phoenix Chick has flying. And in this particular build, I feel like it's the better 1-drop because of what I mentioned earlier with me wanting to push through damage on my creatures rather than just using burn spells. So the fact that it has flying and haste is very important because I can put something like a Monstrous Rage or a Rimrock Knight on it. And there's also the fact that this is a recursive threat because you can bring it back from the graveyard sometimes. But I really like also how this card interacts with Kumano Faces Kakazan here, because a really good start is if you go turn 1 this, and then turn 2 follow it up with Phoenix Chick, because then your Phoenix Chick is going to come into play with a +1/+1 counter from your Saga. You can immediately attack in with your 2-power flyer. However, if this was a Soulscar Mage, in that case, you would put your counter on your Soulscar, and then just pass the turn, because it doesn't have haste. And then at that point, your Soulscar is, susceptible to dying to any given removal spell before it ever gets the chance to get in any damage at all. So for those reasons, I feel like Phoenix Chick is a better fit for this particular build of mono red than Soulscar would be. And also, Phoenix Chick can be a good top deck, whereas Soulscar usually isn't so much, once again, because it doesn't have haste. Those are the 1-drops though. There's 12 of them, and all of these cards, these are in standard right now, so far this is just a standard deck. Changes a little bit when we get to the 2-drops though. We have a couple out of standard, though. There is Bloodthirsty Adversary here and Charming Scoundrel. I have a 2-2 split. I do like both of these cards. They serve similar but also different purposes. So Charming Scoundrel is a very flexible card, but more often than not, what I end up doing with this is just playing this as a 2-2 with haste. Just play it and put the Wicked Roll on itself. Usually get in for some damage, and then it's also nice how if this dies, when the Wicked Roll goes away, it's going to do another damage to the opponent on the way out. Actually, speaking of the Wicked Roll, this also works well with Phoenix Chick, because Phoenix Chick is a pretty good target for putting a Wicked Roll on itself as well, since it has evasion. But then we've also got Bloodthirsty Adversary out of standard. Very similar cards, a 2-2 with haste, so that's basically what this is. But this is usually a much better top deck late in the game because, you can pay the pseudo kicker cost and get back an instant or sorcery out of your graveyard, which can be really big. A lot of the time that can be just, getting back the lightning strike that you need to finish off the game. So I feel like these are, once again, quite good cards, good enough to include in the Pioneer version of this deck, apparently. Here's where we get to the Rimrock Knight, though. So I had a full playset of this card in my deck. I was looking at what decks is this card currently played in Pioneer, and it seems to be 0. It doesn't look like this is played at all. Earlier on, or even earlier this year, there were a few deck lists, some Gruul aggro deck lists that would play a couple copies of this. I don't think they played anymore, and there are no mono red deck lists that seem to have this, but I played the full 4 copies. How that worked was, this actually wasn't in the deck originally, but the night before the event, I was thinking of what could I potentially play as my 2-drops. I was thinking of maybe playing something over Charming Scoundrel, and I was trying to think of what 2-drops were good in mono red in the past, and one that I thought of was Robber of the Rich, which is also out of Throne of Eldraine. So I went to my Throne binder to see if I had any Robbers of the Rich, and I didn't, but next to the spot where that is in the binder is Rimrock Knight, so I saw that card, and then I remembered back in the day, this card was really good in mono red in standard, and I thought about, could it work in this deck? And as I thought about it some more, I started to really like it, because, as I said, I wanted to build this deck really low to the ground, and this card can work well for that, but also since I want to push through damage on my creatures with things like Monstrous Rage and my creatures with evasion, this also works well with that because the adventure part of this, Boulder Rush, is just 1 red instant, gives a creature +2/+Otal in a turn. It's, not a huge effect, but it's very good in this deck, I think, because you can just put it on a Phoenix Chick or a Monastery Swiftsphere. It's actually great with Monastery Swiftsphere because at that point you can almost look at this as being a lightning bolt because you pay 1 mana, give it +2/+0, it triggers prowess, so for your 1 mana, you've gotten +3 power, so if it goes unblocked, that's 3 damage for 1 mana. So I really liked the idea of putting in, you know, some extra copies of just a 1 mana instant that can get in some extra damage, but also this fills out the 2-drop slot, because a 3/1 for 2 is good stats. Those are aggressive stats, and that's good enough in a mono red deck. Yeah, it doesn't do anything else, it can't even block, but that's fine. If I go just, you know, turn 1 Kumano, turn 2 Rimrock, that's still not bad. I still have a 4/2 that can get in some good damage that way. So I did put in the full playset of Rimrock, and it was pretty good. What I had in prior to putting to this was kind of a random assortment of instants and sorceries. I had things like a 1-of Skewer the Critics. I had 1 copy of Shock. It wasn't even a Wild Slash. And then I think I had maybe 2 more Charming Scoundrels or something like that. But the Rimrock Knight was good, especially in the quarterfinals matchup. It was pretty important, actually, because as I said before, my opponent had basically all answers. And what I had in my hand was Rimrock Knight, so I was able to start off the game, and I played 2 of this, I believe, on turn 2 and 3 as just the Rimrock, just giving up the value of the adventure, just playing it as a 3/1, and my opponent had to use their answers. I think it was 2 portable holes that they used on my Rimrock Knight, and if I didn't have that, then, you know, the opponent would have been able to hold up those answers for something potentially more important. You know, if this was, say, like the Skewer, the Critics, or Shock that I had in previously, that would have probably just gone to the opponent's face, and then they would still have their removal that they could leave up for a creature that I would eventually land. And that kind of made me remember why this card was so good back in the day, is because it basically is 2 cards in 1, just like Bonecrusher Giant. Because with the mono red deck back in Throne of Eldraine, almost every card in the deck had kind of a 2-for-1 built into it that way, and I liked bringing that kind of aspect into this deck, because some of these cards do that, like Kumano kind of does, Monstrous Rage does a little bit, you know, light up the stage, but being able to bring in a few more cards that are kind of like 2 cards in 1 gives the deck a little bit more staying power. So that's the story with Rimrock Knight. Going forward, I don't know if I would play all 4 copies of it. I might take out 1 or 2 to play maybe some more copies of, like, Light Up the Stage or something like that, but I do still like it. So then there's also the 4 copies of Bonecrusher Giant. Bonecrusher is awesome in pretty much any deck is in, so we're playing 4 of that. Actually, though, when it came to sideboarding, this was a card that I frequently came to sideboard out, because in some matchups, it's basically just an inefficient burn spell, because if my opponent's on, say, like, maybe a combo deck or something like that, I'm gonna play this as, you know, Stomp, do 2 damage for 2 mana, and then by the time I play my Bonecrusher Giant, and if it gets the opportunity to actually attack, my opponent might just be comboing out. So what I would do is usually sideboard out a couple of these and bring in something a little bit faster. You know, like if my opponent is on, say, the mono green deck, I might bring in a couple End the Festivities instead to try and slow down their start if they have a bunch of elves. Or if they're playing something that can gain them some life, maybe Shieldred or something, I might bring in a couple copies of Rampaging Ferocidon. That's all the creatures though, so onto the burn spells. This is pretty standard for Play with Fire, and for Lightning Strike, I think most mono red decks would play the full 4 copies of both of those. Something I like here about my Play with Fires is that all 4 of them are different, and I didn't plan it out this way. It's just when I went to buy my playset of this, the store didn't have multiple copies of any one of them in stock, so I just bought what they had, which was 1 of each, and that's what I have here, but hey, it works, right? Then we've got 2 Light Up the Stage and 1 Ren's Resolve. So these burn spells, these are the same as standard as well. So the only non-standard cards so far have been Rimrock Knight and Bonecrusher Giant. There's Light Up the Stage, that's not in standard. However, there is Ren's Resolve, and then there's also Reckless Impulse, which does the same thing. I have a split of these right now because I would say they're on kind of similar power levels, but sometimes you want to cast one of these before combat, and sometimes you want to cast them after. Well, ideally you would be able to cast it before, but a lot of the time with Light Up the Stage, you need to deal damage first, so you have to cast it after. But, you know, I do like both of these. I would probably go up 1 more copy of a card like this, just because, you know, these are very good 2-for-1s, and mono red basically gives you some some good card advantage. But this is the same as the standard deck as well. It's just instead of playing Light of the Stage, you would play more copies of this. And then also the same as the standard deck. This is probably my favorite card in the deck, actually, Monstrous Rage. This card is incredible. And I mentioned before about Rimrock Knight, the instant part of it, kind of being similar to a lightning bolt type of thing if you think of it in the right way. That's the same with this card, except sometimes this is even better. Because for 1 mana, you get to give a creature +2/+0 until end of turn at instant speed, but then you also put a monster roll on it, so it gets another +1/+1 and trample. So the fact that this can give your creature trample is huge, because if you even just have a Monastery Swiftspear and nothing else, you put a Monstrous Rage on it, until end of turn your Swiftspear has turned into a 5/4 with trample for just 1 mana. So you can get in a lot of surprise damage that way, even if your opponent blocks. But also, it keeps the +1/+1 and trample even after the turn, because it keeps the roll on it. So, you know, if you have your Boulder Rush from your Rimrock Knight or something, you can get even more damage in that way. Or if you have anything that just triggers prowess, the fact that it has trample is huge. I feel like Monstrous Rage here is probably one of the most powerful red cards that's been printed in a long time, and I expect this to be a player in a lot of you know, mono red or red X whatever decks in many formats. I believe it's already seeing a ton of play in Pioneer. It's probably in Modern as well, but this card I think is very good. Now we get to the lands, and one of the main things that this deck has up in the Pioneer version over the standard one. The Pioneer version of this deck gives you access to 4 copies of Ramunap Ruins. So if you've watched any of my older deck techs where I talk about mono red decks, you know why I like this card. But basically, like, this is one of my favorite cards. One of my favorite things to do is to get the opponent down to 2 life. Maybe they start to stabilize, but then I just top deck a Ramunap Ruins, and there's literally nothing they can do about it unless they have some kind of stifle type effect, which most decks tend to not have. Because, you know, this is basically a shock on a land, which, you know, playing the land doesn't go on the stack, so your opponent can't counter it, and it doesn't even target the opponent. It just does 2 damage to each opponent, so even if they have like a ley line or something in play, this still gets through that. So having access to 4 copies of Ramunap Ruins is pretty huge, and I think this helps out the deck a lot. I do have 1 copy of Spikefield Hazard here, as just, it's not a free inclusion, not free at all, because the land part of it comes into play tapped, but it's basically playing like half a land, kind of, because, you know, the deck doesn't want to play a whole lot of lands, but I have put this into play as a tap land many times before, and it has been very useful, but I have also cast the front side of this as just 1 point of burn, which has also been very useful, so I like this as a 1-of. We have Sokinzon, which is basically a free inclusion, just a 1-of. This is also out of standard. And then this is another part where the deck is a little bit different than the other mono red decks you might see, is I'm only playing 1 copy of Den of the Bugbear. I see a lot of lists will play upwards of 4 copies of this. And it is a very good card, but it's definitely not a free inclusion, because this comes into play tapped a lot of the time if you control 2 or more other lands. So if this is your 3rd land, anything 3rd or higher, it's going to come into play tapped. And when, you know, the deck is really low to the ground and trying to go as fast as possible, if the land that you need to use on one of your turns comes into play tapped, that can make the difference of whether you win or lose, because that can hinder you just enough to let your opponent be able to stabilize. So I really don't want this to come into play tapped, and if I have more than 1 copy of it, that seems to happen a pretty significant amount of time. But I do still want to have access to this in the deck, because, you know, this card is very good. It's a very good creature land. This is actually what won me the quarterfinal. I had this in play, and as my opponent were grinding each other out, this is what was able to push through the last bit of damage, so it was very good to have this, but I just don't like them coming into play tapped. And also, one thing is, a lot of the time with this deck, to get in the last bit of damage, you might have a Ramunap Ruins, and you just need to top deck any land in order to get to your 5th land to be able to activate this and do the 2 damage. Well, if that 5th land is Den of the Bugbear, that's not going to happen. You're going to have to wait a turn because this is going to kind of play tapped. So that's the reason why I only have one of this card right here in the deck. And I feel like I'm happy with just this as a one of. I like that number of dens. So for the total number of lands on the deck, I'm playing 21, including this Spike Field Hazard right here. The rest of the lands are just basic mountains. I have 14 of them here. 21, you know, some decks play more, some play less. I feel like most mono red decks would play less, but I've got 21 lands in here. Then for the sideboard, I've got this Gigantha as my companion. It's sometimes I can do stuff. If you play your Gigantha, you're definitely not on your plan A. You're probably not on plan A, B, C, or D, but sometimes this can get you there. Got a red cap melee, a couple of these. You know, it's good in the mirror. Can be good in some other matchups where your opponent has red creatures. A couple of braids for flexible removal / artifact removal. Got a flame sweep here. Good for go wide decks like elves or soldiers, things like that. You know, the mono white decks. It's the same thing with End of Festivities here. Good against little go wide decks that have creatures with 1 toughness. I have 4 copies of Rending Volley, which was very important once again in that quarterfinal match against the blue-white Spirits deck. This card did a lot of work, but Rending Volley is very good for just 1 mana, the fact that it can't be countered. So I feel like the full playset is probably warranted in the sideboard. And then I got these 3 Rampaging Ferocidons against any deck that might want to be gaining life or anything that might want to be particularly grindy. It's pretty good against, you know, the Cat Oven decks, things like that. So I like this guy, and I think 3 copies is pretty good. Also, it's good against Sheoldred because not only does it turn off the life gain, it has Menace. So if your opponent taps out and plays a Sheoldred when you have this in play, you can just attack through it and get in even more damage that way. So that was my my standard mono red deck that I played in Pioneer with my 4 of Rimrock Knight, and I guess it was good enough to qualify me for the regional championship. So I guess I'll play in that in a few months. I thought that would be fun to talk about today. You know, it's mono red there's nothing particularly innovative about playing mono red in itself, but kind of felt like this deck list in particular and some of the card choices were a bit unusual and would be fun to talk about today. And as I mentioned earlier, I had been playing with this on Arena. I've been streaming on Arena a fair bit, so if you're interested to see me play that live, you can find me at 8th Place Dave on Twitch. That's where I stream my gameplay. Anyway, though, that's gonna do it for this one. So if you're still watching, thanks for watching. It'd be cool if you can like and subscribe and all of that kind of stuff. I'd encourage everyone to come join my Discord server. You can find a link to that in the video description below. And I mentioned that this event that I played at was part of the face-to-face tour hosted by Face-to-Face Games, which is a sponsor of the channel. They're the largest Magic store in Canada, and you can use code 8thPlaceDave at the checkout. You can save 5% on your order at face2facegames.com. Also, at this past event, I did meet a decent number of people that watch the channel, so if you're watching right now, it was cool to meet all of you. I hope I was able to give you a Hashtag Oasis if you didn't already have one. Also, just before I go, I'd like to thank all of the patrons that support me on Patreon. But otherwise, though, thanks for watching, and I'll talk to you later.